He stood on the small stage, smiling like he owned the room, champagne in hand, and said it so casually I almost thought I misheard it. And of course, thank you to my beautiful fiancé, who's still working as a waitress. Can you believe it? The crowd chuckled politely, as if it were a harmless joke. But I felt every eye glance at me, then look away, embarrassed on my behalf. My face burned, not from shame, but from the sting of recognition. That wasn't the first time he'd said something like that. He had a talent for dressing disrespect up in charm. Every time I brought up my app, my project, my late nights, coding after shifts, he'd smile and say something like, "It's cute that you have a hobby." But tonight was different. Because tonight, I wasn't just his fiancée. I was also the woman whose project had just closed its first round of funding. Something I hadn't told him yet. Not out of secrecy, but out of survival. Because when you're building something real, something that matters, you learn quickly who to protect it from. And so I stood there in my soft blue dress, holding my glass, letting the laughter settle, and I smiled too. But my smile wasn't polite. It was planted. Ready. Waiting for the right moment to bloom into something he would never forget. I used to think silence was strength. That biting my tongue made me noble. That letting his words roll off my back meant I was above it. But moments like this chipped away at me quietly, like water on stone. Each comment he made about my job, my past, my unrealistic ideas, never sounded cruel in the moment. But together, they built a cage I didn't notice I was in. I met him while working late shifts. He came in after his finance meetings, loosened tie, expensive watch, always polite to the staff, but in that patronizing, overly charming way that felt more like performance than kindness. He asked for my number by leaving a $100 tip. I should've known then what kind of man buys attention like it's owed to him. But I was tired, flattered, and still learning how to read the difference between generosity and ego. Over time, his compliments started coming with caveats. "You're so smart for someone who didn't go to college. You've got potential once you stop playing around with these little tech experiments." I swallowed each one. I told myself, he doesn't mean it like that. But deep down, I knew he liked me small, manageable, predictable. And maybe once, that version of me would have laughed along with the crowd. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, I had something he didn't know. And the part of me he thought he'd buried? She was wide awake and standing right behind my smile. The rest of the guests laughed, clinked their glasses, and returned to their hors d'oeuvres like nothing had happened. But something had. Inside me. It wasn't a dramatic shift, no cinematic thunderclap, just a quiet crack in the foundation I'd built around him. I scanned the room, his colleagues from the firm, dressed in tailored suits, sipping champagne. With the ease of people who had never lived paycheck to paycheck. His sister, eyes narrowed slightly at me, always looking for signs I didn't belong. And his mother, smiling graciously, as if tolerating me was some act of charity. I'd spent months trying to mold myself into someone they'd approve of. I read the books they mentioned at dinners, learned to pronounce the wines they drank, bought dresses a full paycheck at a time just to blend in. But standing there in that room, I didn't feel like I belonged, and for the first time, I realized I didn't want to. Not in the way they needed me to. Because I didn't build my app to impress them. I built it because I saw a problem one else cared about. Because I knew I could solve it. Because I refused to wait for permission to matter. So when he raised his glass for one more toast, hand on my waist like punctuation, I excused myself. Walked over to the mic by the band. And as the room quieted, as confused eyes turned toward me, I took a breath. I wasn't just about to speak. I was about to arrive. I tapped the microphone gently, the soft feedback slicing through the murmurs and silverware clinks. People turned, half smiling, unsure if it was a game, a speech, or a mistake. I could feel his stare from across the room, confused, frozen. In place, that champagne glass paused midair like he was waiting for a cue. I smiled, gently. Not the kind of smile that seeks approval, but the kind that knows exactly where it's going. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, voice steady, unshaken. "It means a lot to celebrate with friends, family, and investors." That word hung in the air like a slow-moving comet, unfamiliar, unexpected, and too bright to ignore. Whispers flickered across the tables. A few glances darted toward him. I continued before the tension had time to thicken. "Some of you know I've been working on something for a while. A platform that connects underserved food service workers to emergency legal resources. What started as a late-night idea on my waitress notepad turned into a working prototype, then a beta, and last week, I paused, just enough, we closed our first seed round at $1.2 million. The room shifted. The air changed. A silence, not of discomfort, but of sudden recalibration. I wasn't the story they thought I was. And in that moment, I didn't feel like a waitress, or a fiancé, or even a woman proving a point. I felt like the one thing he never believed I could be, undeniable. Faces shifted slowly, like portraits rearranging themselves in real time. The men who had barely acknowledged me at dinner suddenly leaned forward. His boss tilted his head, visibly, trying to connect the woman in front of the mic with the outdated label in his mind. Even his mother blinked twice, folding her hands tighter in her lap, as if trying to grip some sense of control. But I didn't need their validation. I wasn't speaking for them. I was speaking to the part of me that had been silenced in every room like this one. The version of me that held trays and dreams at the same time. The girl who memorized menus by day and built back-end systems by night. I looked at him, finally, he hadn't moved. Not a blink. Not a breath. Just that expression. Of someone who realized too late that the game wasn't theirs to win anymore. I thought I might feel triumphant, but I didn't. What I felt was calm. Not spiteful. Not vengeful. Just whole. I wrapped up with a final line. To everyone who supported me, your belief built more than a business. It built me. Applause followed. Uneven, uncertain, but real. I stepped down from the mic, not rushed, not glowing, just grounded. He approached me, face flushed, voice low. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him, really looked. "Because you never asked," I said softly. "And when I tried, you made it sound small." He didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked toward the guests, toward the cameras, the curated centerpieces, the illusion of control unraveling in slow motion. He reached for my hand, perhaps to steady the image, or maybe himself, but I pulled it back gently. Not out of anger, out of truth. The kind of truth that no longer fits inside an apology. I watched him try to gather himself, choosing between charm and shame, but neither served him now. Because the version of me he was prepared to manage no longer existed. She had outgrown the story he wrote for her. I excused myself politely and walked past the white marble archways, past the soft laughter returning to the room, and out to the balcony overlooking the city skyline. The air was cooler out there, realer. I could hear the muffled music inside, the clink of glasses, but out here, it was just me, and the life I was finally claiming in full volume. I thought about all the nights I'd coded alone, too tired to think, too determined to stop. I remembered hiding my excitement every time I hit a breakthrough, just to keep the peace. And now, I didn't need to hide anymore. The truth was louder than the silence had ever been. As I stood there, watching the lights flicker across the horizon, I didn't feel like I'd won something. I felt like I'd returned to something, myself. And I knew then, this night wasn't about revenge. It was about release. I stayed out on that balcony longer than I meant to. Not because I was hiding, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit into a room or smoothing my voice to be more digestible. I was simply still. The city lights didn't care about last names, careers, or carefully planned engagement parties. They just shimmered, bright, indifferent, free. I thought about how often I had played small to make others feel big. How often I had let people confuse humility with silence. But building my app taught me something different. It taught me how to keep going when no one clapped. How to listen to feedback without letting it become a muzzle. How to invest in myself even when the returns were invisible. I had worked double shifts not just to pay rent, but to fund my dream, while the man inside was busy funding his image. I remembered the night he told me, "You should just focus on being my wife. This tech thing isn't real." He said it like he was doing me a favor. But tonight proved something. Not to them. To me. That my voice was never too loud, my dreams never too naive, and my ambition never too much. It just didn't fit into his version of love. And maybe that wasn't love at all. Maybe that was control dressed up as care. And maybe letting go of that wasn't a loss, it was the beginning of my freedom. I leaned against the balcony rail, letting the breeze thread through my hair like a silent applause. In that quiet space, something inside me softened. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Disappointed, maybe. But more than that, I felt a strange kind of relief. Because for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to finally see me. I saw myself. And I liked what I saw: messy, determined, imperfect, but unapologetically real. I thought about how much time I had wasted trying to translate my worth into a language someone else could understand. How many times I had bitten back excitement just to avoid being called too much. But now, I realized something quietly radical: I didn't need to be understood to be whole. I didn't need his approval, or his family's reluctant smiles, or the way he used to introduce me like I was a pleasant footnote in his story. I wasn't a side character. I was the author. The room inside still buzzed with conversation, probably reshaping their opinions of me in real time, but that wasn't my concern anymore. Let them revise their stories. I had already rewritten mine. The girl they thought they knew, the just a waitress, the soft-spoken fiancé, the easy-to-ignore dreamer, was gone. Not because she broke, but because she bloomed. Quietly. On her own. And with roots so deep no one could pull her back into the soil of someone else's shadow. I walked back into the room, not to reclaim anything, but simply to move through it on my terms. The music had shifted into something slower, richer. People nodded at me now with unfamiliar expressions, curiosity laced with respect, maybe even regret. But I didn't search their eyes for anything. I didn't need them to get it. I just needed to keep walking. He stood near the dessert table, still trying to gather the fragments of a night he thought he controlled. When our eyes met, there was no tension, just a mutual understanding that something had broken, and that I wasn't going to be the one to fix it. I passed him without a word. Not as a punishment, but as a declaration. I didn't need closure from someone who couldn't handle my opening. I sat at a small table near the corner, took a sip of water, and checked my phone. Notifications buzzed, texts from friends who saw the live stream, a message from my mentor saying, "Proud" doesn't even begin to cover it. I smiled. Not for show, but because it felt earned. And in that quiet, I realized the most powerful thing I'd done all night wasn't taking the mic. It was taking back the space I used to give away. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. Some women burn the room down. Others just leave the door open and walk through it without ever looking back. I didn't burn anything. I simply stopped asking for permission to shine. The next morning, the apartment felt different. Not physically, it was the same polished marble floors, the same sleek kitchen he insisted on remodeling for resale value, the same perfectly aligned bookshelf that always made me feel like I couldn't even move a candle without breaking something. But emotionally, it was quieter. Like the space had finally accepted the truth echoing inside it. He hadn't come home. I wasn't surprised. A part of me even expected him to stay out, maybe to avoid the weight of facing me without the crowd, or the music, or his carefully curated smile. I walked barefoot to the window, pulled the curtain open, and let the sunlight in, fully, unapologetically. It spilled across the room like it hadn't in months. I made myself coffee, not for him this time, but exactly the way I liked it. Strong, unsweetened, grounding. And while it brewed, I opened my laptop. No hesitation. No glancing over my shoulder. No feeling like I had to hide my ambition behind open browser tabs of recipes and ring settings. Just code, emails, investors, growth charts. My life. Mine. Not the version I watered down to be accepted. Not the life I waited to start until someone gave me permission. Just mine. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just existed. And it felt revolutionary. Sometimes, power doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes, it shows up in the smallest, most personal moments. Like finally breathing in a room you used to hold your breath in. I spent the morning doing things I used to postpone. I reorganized the tiny office I had carved out of the guest bedroom, the one he called my little hobby zone. I finally printed out the incorporation papers for my startup, laid them flat on the table, and signed them with a pen that hadn't seen sunlight in months. It wasn't dramatic, no champagne, no victory dance, just a quiet, final punctuation on a sentence I had been afraid to finish. Around noon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. Not to clear my head, but to feel the ground under my feet. To remind myself that I was here, alive, and no longer shrinking to fit beside someone else's ego. I passed the bakery where we used to argue in hushed tones. The shop window still displayed our favorite pastries, untouched. Funny how the world keeps going when your own story splits wide open. Back at home, my phone buzzed again, this time, a message from him. Just 4 words, "Can we talk later?" I stared at it, letting the weight of those words settle. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I finally understood the difference between needing closure and choosing peace. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because I had already spoken. Not with a fight, but with presence. Not to him, but to myself. And in that silence, I felt something stronger than victory. I felt like I was finally living from the inside out. By evening, I had packed a single overnight bag. Not because I was running away, but because I was choosing distance, temporary, but necessary. I left a note on the counter, not addressed to him, just a single sentence that read, "I need space that doesn't shrink me." No signature. No apology. Just clarity. I booked a quiet suite at a small inn downtown, a place I had bookmarked months ago but never dared to reserve. It had no concierge, no valet, just creaky wood floors and warm lighting, the kind of place built for thinking instead of performing. As I stepped inside, something loosened in my chest. There was no pressure to smile, no expectation to explain. Just air. Honest air. I sat by the window, the city humming below, and opened my journal. Not to write a dramatic entry, but to scribble down a promise to myself: I will never again beg to be seen. The words felt sacred, like a contract signed with everything. I had survived. I looked at my reflection in the glass, not glamorous, not perfectly poised, but deeply present. The kind of woman who had worn invisibility like armor for too long. And now? She didn't need armor. She had truth. She had her name on the incorporation papers. Her own rhythm, her own bank account, her own breath. I didn't slam the door behind me. I left it open. Because when you outgrow a room, you don't need to lock it. You just stop waiting for it to feel like home. A few days later, I returned home, not because I missed him, but because I missed my own space. And this time, I walked through the front door differently. I wasn't bracing for tension or preparing to shrink into the corners. I was claiming what was mine, not just the apartment, but the voice that had once gone quiet inside it. He was there, sitting on the edge of the couch, like someone rehearsing a monologue he wasn't sure would land. I nodded politely, calm, almost distant. He started to speak, voice softer than I remembered, but I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Because his words, whatever they were, wouldn't change what I now knew about myself. He tried to explain the way men do when they're not used to losing the narrative. It wasn't about the title, he said. I just didn't expect you to do all that. I almost smiled. Almost. Instead, I thanked him. Not sarcastically, genuinely. Because in trying to minimize me, he gave me the clearest mirror I'd ever held. In his shadow, I found my outline. In his doubt, I found my drive. And now, there was nothing left to argue about. I wasn't here to fight or fix. I was here to decide. And sometimes, the strongest choice you can make isn't whether to stay or go, but whether to keep letting someone else's comfort define the size of your light. I sat down across from him, not to reconnect, but to say goodbye, with grace. I told him I'd be moving out by the end of the month. Not in a dramatic exit, not with yelling or accusations, but with steady eyes and a voice that didn't waver. He blinked, like he hadn't expected me to be so calm. Like he thought the fire would have died down and I'd shrink back into the comfort of apology. But there was no fire now. Only clarity. I didn't list every moment he had dismissed me. I didn't replay every microcut I had bandaged alone. That story no longer needed to be told. I had lived it. Survived it. Outgrown it. He offered a soft, almost sad, "I didn't mean to make you feel small." And I believed him. But that wasn't the point. Intent didn't undo impact. I wasn't here to make him feel worse or better. I was here to end the part of my life that required constant justification. I stood, nodded once, and walked into the bedroom to begin packing a few boxes. There was no ceremony in it. No music swelling in the background. Just the quiet rhythm of someone choosing themselves. For the first time, my decisions weren't reactions to his behavior. They were mine, entirely. As I folded clothes and taped boxes, I realized I wasn't grieving a lost relationship. I was shedding a version of myself I no longer recognized. The woman who once needed approval now only needed peace. And peace, I had finally learned, doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes, it comes with silence and a door left open. A week later, I was gone. My new place wasn't impressive by his standards, no concierge, no skyline view, no imported tiles, but every inch of it breathed like freedom. The first morning I woke up there, sunlight poured through the curtainless window and landed on a small object on the dresser, the watch. The same one he said was fake. The one I wore at dinner to remind him and myself of what couldn't be diminished. I hadn't worn it since, but I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I picked it up, held it for a second, and smiled, not because it had value, but because I did. Later that week, I attended another gala, this time as a guest speaker. My app had just received a round of funding, and someone on the board had quietly nominated me for an award. When they introduced me, they didn't say just a teacher or someone's fiancé. They said my name. My full name. And the room clapped before I even opened my mouth. But even then, I didn't let it define me. Because real worth doesn't come from applause, it comes from walking into a room without needing anyone to clap. That night, I wore the same dress. Not out of spite, but out of poetry. I stood at the microphone, took a breath, and simply said, "Thank you." Not for the award, but for finally seeing me. And maybe, most of all, for reminding me that I was always meant to be seen.